o'clock. I think we'll wait a moment or two here. Just waiting for a few more people to log in, and we will get started momentarily. Okay, we're just a little past 7 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Hi, my name is Peggy Norris, and I'm the Adult Services and Materials Management Supervisor for the Louisville Public Library. I want to introduce my colleague and the Youth Services Supervisor at the library, Kristen Bodine. She's going to help moderate for us tonight. One small piece of housekeeping. If you have questions, you can raise your hand. Kristen will be keeping charge of that and fielding questions and sending them on to Dr. Mosby Tyler. And there'll be an opportunity to interact throughout the presentation. Dr. Anita Mosby Tyler is the Chief Catalyst and founder of the Equity Project, LLC, which is designed to support organizations and communities in building diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. She's the former Senior Vice President and Chief Inclusion Officer for Children's Hospital Colorado, and is also the former Executive Director of the Office of Human Resources for the City and County of Denver. Dr. Mosby Tyler, a consultant accredited by the Georgetown University National Center for Cultural Competence, is nationally recognized for her equity work with nonprofit, community, government, and for-profit organizations. In her work, Dr. Mosby Tyler specializes in the development and delivery of leadership, equity, diversity, cultural responsiveness, and inclusiveness training programs and strategies. Please join the City of Louisville and the Louisville Public Library in welcoming Dr. Mosby Tyler tonight. And with that, I will pass it on to you.
Peggy, thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks to each of you for carving out a little time out of your evening to spend some time with us on a topic that I think is an important one in this moment. And that is, how do we actually undo this thing that we call diversity fatigue? Before we get started, I want to say to you that if we can just take an hour tonight to make tonight all about you. I know that in a climate like this, in a moment like this in history, it's sometimes very hard to think about yourself. But tonight I'm going to ask you to think about yourself and only yourself. I want you to pretend like you're on a plane and you're listening to that spiel about putting the oxygen mask on yourself first. That's really what I want you to think about tonight. That's the context that I'd like you to have. I know that we are virtual here and we don't see each other, and that makes it a little bit more difficult. But there are a couple of times tonight where I actually want to toss out some thoughts to you and have you weigh in. And so Kristen will be helping us out as you raise your hand to volunteer to weigh in so that we might hear your voice. We want to have a good blend of hearing your voice tonight. And of course, you can always type your thoughts in the chat room if that feels a little bit better for you. So on that note, let us get started. You know, when I thought about the title of this presentation, Undoing Diversity Fatigue certainly was one of the most important things for me to say, because I do think we have to figure out a way to mitigate some of that. But more importantly, the tagline was important, and that is giving ourselves some grace as we move through this moment. I know I don't have to tell you what a difficult time in history it is, but one thing that is happening that I want you to know a little bit about is something that's called the recency effect. It's plaguing us right now. The recency effect is a phenomenon where the most recently presented facts or information or impressions or items or learned or remembered better than material that was presented earlier. I mean, it's an episode and a snapshot that we're operating from. We remember yesterday, but not necessarily what even happened a week ago. If you think about our news cycles and all of the things that we are burdened with holding and understanding, our brains are just holding on to the thing that's nearest to us. Now, the reason I'm raising recency effect with you is one of the most fatiguing things that we have is that we have this repeat of information, and no real way to tie the information together. We're missing the linkages of what's happening today and what happened even a week ago, let alone a month ago, let alone a year ago. Our inability to tie our present to our history is problematic. It's frustrating, and it doesn't give us clarity in what we're tackling today. So I do want you to know that one of the things for us to continue to work on individually is to explore how often we actually are operating in the recency effect. As you make decisions and judgments, as you look at your own behaviors, are they based in a complete picture, or are they based in things that you just saw in a snapshot yesterday or today? So recency effect, something for us to tackle. All of it is creating some discomfort in us. And I do want you to know that that discomfort that you're feeling is painful, but it has a name, and the name of it is called grief. I call it grief plus because it's more than grief, but it is grief that we're sitting in right now. I talk about this often in this moment. I think it's important for us to pause long enough to talk about this. You know what grief is. We know it mostly when someone that we love dies. That's the kind of grief we know well. Well, there's not that much difference between that feeling and this feeling. You know, the world as we once knew it is forever changed. That's called loss. The way that we're operating, we're virtual. That's called loss. People around you have lost their businesses, or maybe they're even unemployed. That's called loss. So that's the discomfort we're in right now. And I share that with you right up front because I want you to know that we cannot push each other to go back to normal while in the midst of grief. That even goes for you. You can't just pretend everything's okay, I've got to keep moving when you're in the midst of grief. So how do we move out of grief? We move out of grief by one, calling it what it is, grief, but by also understanding the things that are in the cycle of grief. Many of you already know this. Bear with me a minute because there may be people that don't. The cycle of grief, at least this cycle of grief, has 5 moving pieces, and we all move through all of them. You see, it starts with denial. I don't know about you, but when COVID-19 hit, I was in denial for at least a couple of weeks. Couldn't believe we were in a pandemic. Couldn't believe we were quarantining. Couldn't believe businesses and employers were shutting down all around me. Denial. And then by the time the George Floyd death happened, on TV for all of us to see, I moved right out of denial and into anger. I was frustrated, filled with anxiety. I even felt a little hostile. And then a few weeks after that, I moved into depression. I'm normally not a hopeless person, but I certainly felt very helpless. I was overwhelmed at what was going on. And then a couple of months ago, I moved to the next stage of bargaining. Bargaining is where you are struggling to find meaning, but at least you're trying to find some meaning. And that's what I started to do. I started telling my own stories and encouraging other people to tell their stories too. And then you'll see the last stage there is acceptance. It's where there's a new plan in place, or you've put a new plan in place and you've moved on. Well, I'm not there. I don't know what the new plan is yet, and I haven't moved on. So bargaining is where I am. I want you to just explore this for a minute. I want you to think about where you might be in this grief cycle. And I do want you to know it doesn't come in a linear way. You could be in denial and go straight to bargaining, so they don't come in order. And it also is possible that you go backwards. You could get all the way to acceptance, and something could happen in your family or in the community or in the country, and you can go back the other direction. That's how it moves. But it is important for you to know where you might be in this moment, in this cycle. Why do I care about that other than I care about you? I care about that because not all parts of this grief cycle are healthy for you to stay in for long periods of time. If you look at that blue bar that's running across the bottom, it gives you a little hint about what you might need more of to move to other parts of the cycle. So, for example, if you're in denial and anger, what it's saying there is you need more information and you need more communication. And that means you need not a lot of opinions and narrative. You need facts and data and truth. Those are the kinds of things that help you out of those two parts of the cycle. If you're in depression, it says you need more emotional support. Now, that could be on a continuum. It could be everything from I need to be with my colleagues, my community, or it could mean you need mental health support. It's a continuum of things that could provide your emotional support. And then if you're at bargaining and acceptance, it's saying what benefits you most is guidance and direction. That's leadership. That's strategy and vision is clear to you. So be thinking about not only where you are in this cycle, I want you to be thinking about what it would take for you to have a healthy movement through the cycle. It's very important not to ignore where you are. Now, I know you know this, but there is more than grief going on in this moment. I think many of these things are related to grief, can cause grief, or can complicate grief. There are a lot of things going on, and I wanted to spend a couple of minutes just sharing some things that are going on. You know, my work takes me across the country, which is a lot easier now that we're virtual because there's no airport involved. But even before the pandemic, when I was on a lot of airplanes leaving Denver, I got to tell you, there were some things that were happening even before the convergence of these two pandemics, racial injustice meets COVID-19. Even before that, there were some things that plagued organizations and communities across the country. Things like people were really getting very confused about what the heck we were talking about when we said words like equity or inclusion or equality, and sometimes even diversity. The words were conflating one another and getting more and more confusing. And so people were getting very confused about what they even meant. The other thing that I was seeing a lot of was a hesitancy, even a lack of finesse in talking about hard topics, whether it was race whether it was diversity, whatever it was, we didn't want to do it anymore. We were politicizing and polarizing everything, and no one wanted to have the very healthy, important conversations that we now need to have in a desperate way. People weren't really aware of what biases were looking like. What is your unconscious bias doing to harm other people? Lots of confusion about that. And then I guess one of the most poignant things that I saw along the way is a myth that I want to challenge you around. It is the myth that people of color are responsible for leading this fight, this work around equity, inclusion, and diversity, while white people are the allies. I want to challenge you on that. I want to challenge you because I don't think we are in a position to have some people on the front lines and some people on the sidelines. That's just the world according to Nita. We do need a new cadence for how we do this thing we call justice work. I understand what white allies are all about, but I gotta tell you, we don't need nouns. Ally is a noun. We need verbs. We need some verbs. So one of the things I want you to be thinking about is, what's the right cadence for this work? How do we get everyone to work in a collective where we're all on the front lines doing the things that lift all boats? It's a different strategy and it's a different lens. It's a different way of looking at the way that we've always done things. But I gotta tell you, we're in a world that's a different world than anything we've ever seen too. So it will take all of us to get the job done. So here's one of those things that I see a lot of, even beyond grief. It's called imposter syndrome. And my statement here is very clear. We must tackle our imposter syndrome. So some of you may be wondering, what the heck is imposter syndrome? Well, I'm going to give you a kind of academic answer here. So imposter syndrome can be defined as a collection of feelings of inadequacy. And those feelings persist despite evident success. So in other words, you feel less than even though there's no indication that you should be feeling that way. It makes us suffer from chronic self-doubt, and it creates this sense of intellectual fraudulence in us that overrides any feelings of success. It's like this little whisper in your ear that continues to tell you that you're less than, you're not smart enough, you're not the right person, you're not credible enough, you don't have the background to talk about that. That's what it does, and it's constant, and it is a whisper in your ear. I want you to know about imposter syndrome because imposter syndrome upticks when there's crisis. We're in the middle of a crisis, so you can imagine how much upticking is going on. I want you to reflect on that for a minute too. How often have you felt imposter syndrome yourself? That little negative self-doubt in your ear. You know, if imposter syndrome were a graphic, it would look a little bit like this. It would be you assuming that what you know is a lot less than what everybody else knows. When the reality is, you know some stuff and other people know some stuff. But again, it's this inflated sense that you somehow are less than. Or let's say you're thinking about jobs. It is you believing that people are hyper qualified for jobs, and then there's little old you, not qualified at all. It has you to believe that. Or it could be around things you beat yourself up for that are things that are completely out of your control. for stuff everyone has literally already forgotten about. Or better yet, stuff nobody else even noticed in the first place. That's what imposter syndrome will do. So let me put this in the context of this moment in history. We are in at least 2 pandemics. One of them is the pandemic of racial injustice. We are in a racial reckoning moment right now. If you identify as a white person in this moment, you may be prone to imposter syndrome. I'm not saying everybody else isn't, because you can be too. I want you to know where it's very illuminated right now. And why would people that identify as white be more prone to imposter syndrome right now? It's because we really are shifting the game plan. We need to hear all voices in this moment. And what you might feel as a white person is that you aren't the right one to have a voice in this moment, or that you're not qualified to have a voice in this moment. Let me help you dispel that myth. Put your oxygen mask on. We need you on the front lines in this work too. When imposter syndrome begins to happen, you will feel it, all of us collectively. I know when I have it, I feel it in my body. I feel like I'm shrinking. That's how you'll feel. You just want to melt into your chair or go through the floor. You feel that shrinking feeling. I want you to mitigate that, because it's not true. You are good enough and smart enough and credible enough, and you are the right one. So how do you mitigate imposter syndrome? One, you have to call it what it is when you start feeling it. Don't just name things, feelings. I want you to call it imposter syndrome. And better yet, give it a name. My imposter's name is Genevieve. I hope that's nobody's name on this call. It's the other Genevieve. When Genevieve shows up with me, I get to call her Genevieve, and I get to brush her off my shoulder. It's a physical move that I have that helps to remind me that the thing that's happening to me can't stay. Whatever it takes for you. I had to personify my imposter. Whatever it takes for you. Be intentional about disrupting it when you feel it. When you leave it in place, it plays into grief, and it plays into this thing. This thing is called diversity fatigue. And the slide says it best. Diversity fatigue is a thing. So when we log off tonight, that's what I want you to remember. Diversity fatigue is a thing. So let's talk about what it is. First of all, let me say this to you. Diversity fatigue doesn't discriminate. It's really fair. It hits all of us. It doesn't care what color you are. It doesn't care where you came from. All of us have had, will have, or used to have diversity fatigue. So what is it? So diversity fatigue, if we all unmuted ourselves, you'd all probably have a different answer, but I'm just going to sum it up in a way that's sort of raw. So diversity fatigue is, I'm just sick and tired of talking about diversity. There you go. That's the definition. I'm sick and tired of talking about it. Now, I want you to know that's a hard thing to say out loud, but that's exactly what it is. It's a weariness. You're exhausted. You're tired of this topic area, not only the word diversity, but everything associated with it. You're exhausted from it. But there are a few things I want you to know about it to explain it better. I want you to know that diversity fatigue is always, always rooted in something. It has a source. Your job is to be thinking about the source of your diversity fatigue. That's very important. I'll give you an example. I know the source of my diversity fatigue. It's my age, and it's how I grew up. I grew up in the segregated South in Georgia, We were still drinking from colored water fountains when I was a child. And Negroes not allowed signs, commonplace. They were everywhere my family tried to go. And they were even doing cross burnings on my college campus at the University of Alabama when I was in college. The Klan was there because they didn't want Black students there. So those things that I just described to you are the source of my diversity fatigue. I'm fatigued because I've been talking about race and racism since I was about 5. Now I want you to think about your source. It doesn't have to match mine. That's not the point. But you should name it. And it could be several different sources of your diversity fatigue, but tell yourself the truth here. What are those things that are at the root of your diversity fatigue? So that's number 1. Number 2, I want you to think about what triggers your diversity fatigue. Now, let me just say this about triggers. They're not right. They might not even be appropriate. They're just triggers. So I wanted to give you that disclaimer. It's important that you know what your triggers are. One thing about diversity fatigue is you don't just wake up in the morning and say, what a beautiful day in Colorado, I've got diversity fatigue. That's not how it works. It gets triggered by something. So I want you to think about the things that happen that trigger you. I'll give you my example. Remember, it's not right, it's just a trigger. I get triggered whenever anybody starts describing how they're discriminated against. Because what happens is I start comparing whatever they just said to what happened to me. Is what they just said as bad as drinking from a colored water fountain or Negroes not allowed signs all over the city? Is it as bad as a cross burning on your college campus? That's what my little brain starts doing. Again, it's not right. It's just a trigger. You have to think about the things that trigger you. And it could be multiple things, but it's so important that you not only name the root of your diversity fatigue, but what is triggering it. And that brings me to the third thing. And the reason that I want you to know what your triggers are. When we get triggered, something really interesting happens in our bodies. There is a visceral reaction in our bodies when we get triggered. Now, some of you might feel the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you get triggered, or maybe your jaws clench tightly when you get triggered. If you have lighter skin, you might get red and flush. I know when I get triggered, I'm doing some major eye rolling. I can just feel it. My breathing changes. I hear deep sighs. And I do a weird thing where I scratch the side of my face. You can see the nail marks on the side of my face. So we have these reactions that are happening in our body. And guess what? Oftentimes, we're unconscious about what our bodies are doing. Why do I care about that? I care about that particularly during this time because when we're unconscious about what our bodies are doing, we have to remember that the whole time our bodies are doing it, somebody's likely looking at us, creating an impression about what we feel, maybe allowing people to spin a narrative about what they think the body language means. I want you to know how important that is in this moment, that we not let our bodies say something that our mind and heart actually don't feel. So I wanted you to know the gravity of diversity fatigue. Diversity fatigue can create both an emotional and a physical paralysis in us that keeps us from doing this work. This work we call diversity, equity, inclusion work. It stops you in your tracks. So I want you to stay with me on this. We're in the grief cycle. We've got imposter syndrome spiking. We've got diversity fatigue happening. So the question for us is this, and this is where I want to pause for just a minute. How are you seeing diversity fatigue, the recency effect, and imposter syndrome show up in you? How's it showing up at work? or in your community or even your family or those you serve, how are you seeing these three things show up? So I want to pause for just a minute, and we'll do it for just a minute. And I'm going to ask Kristen if you can help me with this. If we can get a few volunteers that will share with all of us how you're seeing all three of these things show up around you or in you. That'd be great. I think somebody's going to win a new car if they volunteer to go first. I just made that up, but it sounds great. Anybody willing to volunteer to share with us how you're seeing any of these show up?
Yes, if you'd like to share, please just raise your hand and I will unmute you. Okay, I think it's Linda. I think I heard you guys talking that you are unmuted. Oh, wait, maybe not.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. I'm going to take a stab at this. Since the resurgence of basically our more sensitivity to Black Black experience in America and stuff, my work team has decided that one of our projects is to kind of do a diversity and learning more about the Black experience kind of thing. It's sort of bothering me that my entire work team who are having these conversations, we are all white. We have one Hispanic person in the group, but she's not able to participate much at all. And so I'm struggling with, it's good that all of, us white people are trying to learn more about what it's like to be Black in America. But I'm also struggling because my earlier introduction to, my privilege and all that was through the neighborhood, and Nita, you know who those strong voices are. It was through those people who are not kind sometimes. Thankfully, you were very kind. So I sort of feel like we need people of color as part of this conversation that we're having to try to learn ourselves, and yet there's, prevailing thing that says, well, it's not really their problem to teach you. It's your responsibility to learn. So it's a real struggle for me. I'm trying to read and I'm actually trying to do some additional work in learning. I feel like I kind of fell behind in my schooling from when I first came into the neighborhood and stuff, and so I'm trying to get, more knowledgeable about what's happening, especially as it relates to what's happening today. But I'm just torn in that place where it's like, well, am I doing enough by just doing it on my own? But is it really right of me to expect us to have people of color come in and say, look, you need to understand, what it's really like, because you'll never really live it yourself, kind of thing. I don't know if that makes sense. I just am just really torn.
Yeah, Linda, thank you for that. It makes plenty of sense. And it goes back to what I said about nouns and verbs. So a part of what you described was the noun part. You're learning, you're figuring some things out, you're being an ally. That's absolutely appropriate. It's the verb part. The verb part is, and what shall I do? What must I do? And this is where the imposter syndrome sneaks in, because it's the imposter syndrome that tells you you're not credible enough or you don't have the lived experience to be doing anything. So I want you to continue to challenge that little voice that keeps telling you that maybe you're not the right one. Don't let that create the conflict for you. At this juncture, we don't have time to critique who's the most credible to be on the front lines of this. Everybody needs to be on the front lines of this. But we are really accustomed to being in that status quo model where we've assigned expertise to the people that have been most marginalized in the system. Everybody else is sort of on the side. And we've got to assign expertise. Our expertise is different. My lived experience as a Black person doesn't match yours, but there's some strength to your lived experience that we need as we tackle these really difficult issues. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Linda.
And we also have Jennifer. So Jennifer, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Hi, I think that I very naively and thought that I was living in more of a post-racial, post-feminist, where more strides had been made than we actually had made as a society. And my age factors in here also, but I'm a little bit overwhelmed by how that's not the case, and what a complex lot of work still needs to be accomplished here, and that feels very overwhelming at times.
Yeah, Jennifer, thank you for that. I think you and so many people felt that way. Now, what you just said goes back to the comment that I made about the recency effect. I think all along here, we've all lived in the recency effect. Whatever that snapshot of the moment was for us is how we based our understanding of how things work. And so a part of what you're describing is we probably all were in a recency effect that said the worst part of race relations is behind us. That was way back in the 60s. The reality is it never really went away. I think you suppress it, it's still there, and then you get to decide it's not present, but it's been there. And if you think about the lived experience of Black people in America in particular, none of this is a surprise to me. And everything that I see right now is the same thing I've seen all of my life. It's not news to me. So we do have these two different vantage points that's going on in our communities, where some are seeing the gravity of it for the first time and some have just been living through it the whole time. We can't let that polarize us, though. I don't care when you arrived. I'm glad you're here. And again, what an opportunity for us to be working in a collective. I'm excited about that. Thanks for that, Jennifer. I think I'm going to keep going, Kristen, but watch out for anybody else that raises their hand. I'll keep moving, though. I wanted to say this to you. When you start to think about how I started the conversation with grief, and then I got into imposter syndrome, recency effect, and diversity fatigue. One thing that happens with diversity fatigue is it could send you into what's called anticipatory grief. When we get fatigued, especially around these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in a climate like this, anticipatory grief is present or it could be prevalent. It's that feeling we get about what the future holds when we're uncertain. So here we are today. We're living in a lot of unknowns. We've got all of those factors I've already talked about in place, and we don't know what the future is going to hold. Anticipatory grief is when the mind goes into the future and imagines the worst. I want you to sit with that one for a minute. When you are in diversity fatigue, while in anticipatory grief, already imagining the worst, it isn't a great condition for us to make the kinds of changes that we need to make. So I want you to know, with that feeling of being overwhelmed, that paralysis around being able to do the next thing, I want you to know the full comprehensive model of what that is. It is anticipatory grief forming. We imagine the worst. So what do we do about that? Well, one of the things that we do about that, as we mitigate imposter syndrome and we mitigate diversity fatigue, we have to calm ourselves. And the way that we calm ourselves is to come into the present. Remember, anticipatory grief takes you into the future where you're already imagining doom. Pull it in. Pull it into the present. Pull in your focus on the present. What can you do today? What can you do to affect change today? What can you do about your emotional state today? What can you do to mitigate imposter syndrome today or diversity fatigue today? I know that's hard because that's hard for me, but the calmness and the grace that we have to give ourselves has everything to do with us pulling back from forecasting what the future will be and honoring what the present is and can be. You can also start to think about how to let go of things that you can't control. Sign me up for that one. We can't control everything. Even when we're frustrated and we want to fix things, we can't control everything. And so when you think about the load that you carry as a human being, as a mom, as a dad, a friend, a partner, whatever you are in the world, and especially whatever you are to others, let go of things that you can't control so that you might be whole for those that you love, so that you might be whole even for yourself. So letting go of that would be important. It's also a good time to stock up on compassion. You know, one of the things I've learned in this moment is, as hard as it is, and as bad as some of the behaviors are, I will not let that influence love and compassion. You have to think about who you are in the context of what the world is doing, and you don't have to match it. As a matter of fact, the more bright lights we can get around compassion is how I think change will actually happen. So this is a good time. I think sometimes the darkest and the worst times are the best times for compassion, care, grace, understanding. I know that you know this, but one particularly troubling aspect of the social climate that we're in right now is the open-endedness of it all. There's just so much unknown. Anything goes. That part is what causes duress in us. So a couple of things I want you to remember. I want you to remember that as hard as this might be to hear or believe, this is a temporary state. I remember growing up in the ugly times in the civil rights movement. I didn't think that was ever going to end. It did. This is going to end too. It's a temporary state. The second thing that I also want you to know that's very important is I do want you to know that you have power in this moment. Moments like this, especially when we're in diversity fatigue. Diversity fatigue sometimes will have you convinced that there are people that are powerful and you're not. You're powerless. You do have power in this moment. But just like I asked you to name your imposter syndrome and to begin to name things, I actually want you to name your power too. So I've given you a framework to think about. I love this framework. I teach it. I live by it. This is called the 5 bases of social power, and I want you to know about it because I want you to know about your power. Some of us probably were told we didn't have any power. That's not true. We all have power. We just get it from different places. So this model, a really old one, 1954 model, is so relevant today. Here's what it says. It says you've got one of these 5 power bases or all of these 5 power bases. It says, number 1, that if you have legitimate power, it's power that you have that's based on the title, the position, or the rank that you have. That's what it is. It's title power. But I want you to listen to what I said very carefully. There's nothing in that definition that says you have to be competent. I'm just saying. It just says position power. The second one is expert power. It says you get your power from your expertise, your skills, your ability, your knowledge. That's where your power comes from. The third one says referent power. It's the power of reciprocity. You get your power from mutual respect. I respect you, you respect me back. I have referent power. If you're a parent or a grandparent, you know about this one, reward power. It's the power that you have based on your ability to give or take away rewards. And then there's coercive power. That's the power that you have to punish other people. We use all 5 of these. It depends on what's going on, but this is what I want you to know. There is a dominant power base in our country. Doesn't matter what the system or sector or industry is, it's just how our country was built. It's number 1 and number 5. Power normally comes in pairs. So I want you to know that what we're up against together is a system that was founded and bound on number 1 and number 5. What we're trying to do right now in the spirit of this thing that we call equity or justice is we're actually trying to figure out how to wield power that isn't number 1 or 5. So if you had an ideal power base to work with, it would probably be 2 and 3. Expert referent power is ideally the power base that you would want to be using to get to systems of equity and inclusion and all the things I think we probably all care about. There's our conundrum. 1 and 5 is present, 2 and 3 is what we need. How do we fill that gap? So I want you to play around with this power base notion. 1, I want you to be able to name what power bases you think you are personally operating from most often. What about those around you? What are they operating from most often? And then what power bases do you think we need to be leveraging, and how will we do that? I love power base 2 and 3. It's what I promote. It's what I've built in every structure that I've worked in. I think it's where the real power is. It's the people power. But if we don't know things are called power, we won't have any. So I wanted you to see that. Lastly, as I wind up, because I want to leave time for questions and answers and comments if we have any, this is a time to overprotect. Wrap your arms around your colleagues and your families and your friends and your communities, but don't overreact. I don't think it's the time to overreact. It's the time to overprotect. This is leaving the space for compassion. And I'll leave you with this picture. I always end with very old pictures, and this is certainly one of them. It's a picture of yours truly. It's me when I was 8. Clearly feeling great about myself in this picture. And right next to me is my little brother, who clearly is not feeling great about me. I don't think he is now either. And in the background, that's my dad, who's not paying attention to either one of us. I call this picture the triangle, and I wanted to end with it with you. We will be in a triangle. You're going to think that something that you just did was fantastic. And right next to you, in the same uniform, because it's your team member or your family member, is someone who thinks what you just did is not great at all. And then in the background is the person that's supposed to be in charge of it all, who's not even paying attention. That's how the triangle works. And I wanted to share it with you because when the triangle doesn't work, meaning you don't get the support that you need to keep going, you need something else. I call that your anchor. I want you to be thinking about what or who your anchor is, meaning when that triangle doesn't suffice, doesn't give you the support and motivation to keep going, doesn't value the good job that you probably did, who's going to help you to stand tall? Who's going to say keep going? That's what your anchor is. So name your anchor. My anchor has always been community. When my triangle doesn't give me the support system, my anchor is where I go, community. And I feel support. They prop me up, sit me up, and I can keep going. In this justice moment, we all need an anchor. So name it, whatever it is, insert it in this process. So I'm going to wish you the best on this journey in diversity fatigue and imposter syndrome and grief, all things that will be temporary, but won't be mitigated if we don't name it and do something about it. So thank you so much for hearing me out on that and maybe taking a few of these items and committing to doing a little something to mitigate. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll open this up if there are any questions or comments or thoughts. Love to entertain those.
And if you'd like to say a question, just raise your hand and I will unmute you.
When we are not in a virtual environment anymore, we're not going to be accustomed to being able to talk without being unmuted. No, we might miss this moment. Who knows? Susan and Kristen and Marty, for those of you that have put things in the chat room, thank you so much. And I appreciate you. This conversation couldn't have happened without your commitment to be a part of this. If you could just take a few things away with you and employ, that's great. Remember though, it's all about you tonight.
I just had one thing I wanted to say too, and this is just personally how I'm feeling, and I don't know if other people are feeling this way, and it might fall into that imposter syndrome, but I get this strong feeling after being angry about some of the things that we've seen on TV, that I need to do something. I don't know what that something is, and I kind of am partially paralyzed by doing or saying something wrong. So, I don't know, you talked a little bit about overcoming that, but for me personally, that's kind of where I sit right now.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Peggy. I do think there is a hesitancy in this work. We've got a lot of cultures going on right now. We've got a call out culture. We've got cultures that are not graceful about voices. I like to talk about spaces filled with grace. I think if we stay in judgment and critique of one another through this work, people will be afraid to do this work. So we have work to do, I think, in that area. And some of what you're describing might not be imposter syndrome. It could be some real lived experience about being called out or being shamed about whether you know something or you don't know something. So you balance where you think it's coming from. Some things are called trait of fear, meaning it's a perceived danger that you're feeling. And some things are called state of fear, meaning something's actually happened to you before that has you very fearful. So your job would be to think about how much of this is state and how much of this is trait of fear. I appreciate you sharing that. So in the chat room, there's a question about how can I ask my Black colleagues if they're tired from all of this talk and how can I support them better? All right, I'm going to pretend like I'm your Black colleague right now. I'm your Black community member, but I'm going to pretend I'm your colleague right now because that's a question that got asked early on, right after George Floyd's death. What I said to people was, please don't ask me what to do. The best thing you can do for me as a Black person is not to ask me for the checklist for what you're supposed to do right now. That was probably the most painful thing, is to have people coming to me to say, what do we do? What do we do? So what you're doing in effect is you're asking people that are oppressed or marginalized to solve their own oppression, which is a problem. That's very helpful. What I think is lovely is to check in. And I would do it pretty frequently. I try to do check-ins in groups, particularly with Black employees. Before I start a meeting, I just do a check-in. How are we doing in this moment? And what do you need? So that's what I'd probably say. How are you doing in this moment? And what do you need? What can I do for you? Is quite enough. It's quite enough. And it carries a lot of weight. I think your colleagues would be really thankful about that. I see a question that says, are there groups in this area we can participate in to address racial issues? I don't know about in the Louisville area, and it depends on what you mean by address racial issues. Like, is there a racial problem you want to address, or is it an opportunity to talk about race? So if it is about addressing racial problems without me knowing any details about that, there are tons of organizations that you could think about, the ACLU, those kinds of places, if it's that kind of a thing, if it's a justice kind of an issue. If it's a forum to talk about race, there also are interesting organizations. My husband and I have a program called Race Talk University, and it just gives a forum for people to learn how to talk about race in their communities. So it really depends on, I don't know the basis of what you need, but it really depends on what the real issue is there. If you need really good tools around racial equity and how to talk about race, those kind of things, I have two websites that I love a lot. One of them is called racialequitytools.org. Racialequitytools.org. It's lots of different tools about how to talk about race and how to assess whether racial equity is happening, those kind of things. I also like policylink.org, policylink.org. Also a really good website for all kinds of case studies and examples of what happens in communities that have committed to doing equity or racial equity work. It's a nice way for you to see some examples. Those are all things that are really helpful too. Any other thoughts or questions or comments?
It looks like Vida has a hand raised, so I'm going to allow you to talk. You can just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Vida.
Sure. Hello, Dr. Tyler. Thank you so much. I enjoyed your last time your talk and this time. It was very good information. I was wondering if, as a way to address, the imposter syndrome and diversity fatigue, and it's something I'm trying to do, is to just have the thought that racial unity is inevitable and it will happen in the future. And maybe having that hope kind of helps dispel or helps you deal with, not getting into imposter syndrome and having diversity fatigue.
Yeah, I love that. And I agree with you 100%. I think that what you said is the key. But remember, with all of these factors that I talked about, it sends us into that anticipatory grief. Remember, where we look out into the future and accept that doom is out there. We have to figure out a way to keep ourselves from going to that anticipatory grief, because it's when we go there that we miss the beauty of what you just said. We can't even imagine racial unity when we're in the future assuming doom. So I'm with you 100% on there. We've got to figure out ways to get people present focused. Present focus will help us do the work, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And Kristen also has her hand raised, so I'm going to allow you to talk. You can unmute yourself.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you so much for providing these frameworks and this rationality and this compassion and this grace this evening. I've really found it very helpful. And my question is, the complex one, that during this time, especially early in the summer, there were lots of statements and theories and dialogues that asserted that white people should not participate because they don't own this battle. This is not something that implicitly we, and I'm a white privileged Louisvillian, can understand. And I heard that very strongly early in my career back in the late 90s. I feel like I'd come full circle after 2 decades or more of participating in education and equity issues. But the dialogue seems to have changed once again. And I didn't have a good response to that because it was so harsh and so strident. And you've provided some, I think, some responses, but do you have a good response for those of us who've been engaged at least on the fringes of this work? How we can remain engaged in some way and not back out for fear of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, having the wrong feelings in this moment?
Yeah, thank you for that. First of all, I thank you for what you're doing, and I thank you for your honesty. Some of this is going to be language. Well, before language, some of this is a new cadence that we're not accustomed to, and we're angry. So it's hard to do a cadence change in the middle of anger. So know that. The second thing is the language that we use will have to shift. I think in many ways you are, based on just the little that you described to me, you are an active ally. Active. You're a verb. But I think the language will have to change. And you're starting to hear that now, like accomplice. Level sets where your standing is on the front lines of the justice work. So a part of this is we've got to get out of the notion that there's some control we're having of the allies that are over there on the side. Accomplice means I'm with you actively on the front lines. So I think that's going to be iterative work to get people into new language and new understanding. And I got to tell you, especially with BIPOC communities, the only power we've ever held was our own oppression. And now what we're seeing is white people want to help us with that too. I understand the power play. I understand the power play. Sure. But let's change the language. That's a part of what I'm doing in communities now is I'm trying to change the language now so that everybody understands everybody needs to be on the front lines.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a follow-up question in the Q&A about the groups that we can participate in to address racial issues, and just asking to repeat the name of those groups. And I can type those in if you repeat those.
Yeah. So I didn't know how to answer the question because I don't know what the racial issues are. Like, is there a racial issue problem, or do we want a way to talk about race? So if it's about problems, racial issues that are happening on a community level, one of my go-to positions is always the ACLU. The ACLU of Colorado is the place to go. But depending on what it is, I mean, if you go through the layers of that, for example, if you were talking about LGBTQ issues around race, I'd probably go to One Colorado. So it really depends on what the issue is. But I'm going to do, maybe I can share, let me just share, I'm going to share my email address. And why don't you send me more specifics about what you're looking for, and I will email you. I'll just email you directly, and that way you don't have to explain the specifics in the group. And then I'll send you the resources that really are more specific to what I think you're after. Happy to help with that. I just put it in the chat, my email address.
So I wanted to just break into and let you know we're just about at time. It's a little after 8. I didn't know if we had any other questions we wanted to wrap up with, but just wanted to give you a time check there.
Great. Well, it sure has been a pleasure spending time with you tonight. This has been awesome. I thank you for your commitment again and all your great questions and comments. And I'll sort of end with the sentiments that Vita shared with us, that we will have a day, we will, when we all come together and we'll have a unity because we will all be fighting for the same things. And I think we've got equity in our sight line. It's the first time in my whole life that I have felt it. I think it's in our sight line. It won't be easy, but it'll be harder if we don't do it together. So I'm glad I'm with you, and I'm glad you're with me. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for everything tonight. And thank you, Kristen, for being our moderator. And thank you, Madeline, for being our interpreter tonight. Hope everybody has a great evening.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.